Hello again. I'm Dr. Steve Klien from the Department of Communication at the University of Missouri. This is the latest in a series of online video lessons intended to provide you important principles and helpful concepts for the study of communication. The subject of this video is small group communication, an absolutely important topic for any of you who are interested in a 21st century professional career. The concepts and skill sets involved in effective small group communication are absolutely in demand by those looking for both entry-level employees after college graduation, as well as the continuing success of career professionals once in the workplace. Whether the job takes you to collaborative, face-to-face project teams in a more traditional setting, or if you're going to be one of the 20% of American workers, that's 1 in 5 American workers, that is going to continue to work at home via virtual communication technology even after the COVID-19 pandemic is over, small group communication is definitive of the way that many professional organizations accomplish their tasks. So what we want to try to do in this video is to provide an introductory look into what small group communication actually is, what it tries to accomplish, and what are some of the key characteristics that let us know what groups are and how they function. We can start first of all with a pretty simple definition. Small group communication can be understood as interactions among 3 or more people who are connected through a common purpose, mutual influence, and a shared identity. Now, while the first part of this definition is really pretty simple to understand, if you are one of 3 or more people in one collected spot, you are a group. But when people think about small group communication, they often don't really think about the rest of this definition. The notion of groups having a common purpose, the notion of groups engaged in influence, where every member of the group has some sort of effect on every other member of the group, and the fact that what makes a group is the fact that they share a perception of who they are as more than just their individual selves. And so thinking about each of these components of what really makes a group is going to be really important when we start to drill into what is it that makes a group an effective group in terms of their communication and their problem-solving activity. Now, small groups can be of a number of different types. We can think about small groups in terms of task-oriented groups or relational-oriented groups. Task-oriented groups, and thus the clever name, are groups that are involved in accomplishing specific goals, solving problems, completing projects, or other kinds of specific actions. Whereas relational-oriented groups are groups that exist primarily because the people involved in the group are interested in having connections and sharing social time and interactions with the other people in that group. Now, in addition to task-oriented and relational-oriented groups, we can also think about primary versus secondary groups. The difference here is that primary groups are those collections of people with whom you spend the most amount of important time. Primary groups involve members who are significant others. In a previous video of this series, we talked about significant others as people for whom their opinion and perceptions of you are particularly important. So we can think about the folks that we're in relationships with, such as family members, friends, romantic relationships. A primary group is a group that is consisting of significant others. And these are the ones that are most influential to our identity and the ways in which we behave long term. On the other hand, secondary groups are those groups that are potentially more common in your day-to-day life outside of the family. Secondary groups are groups that are not necessarily as important to you as a core element of your self-concept and the long-term train of your life, but these are groups that you get together for specific kinds of purposes. So for instance, your fellow employees at the workplace, or if you're a member of a club or social organization that you have some aspect of social identity with, but it's not necessarily something where you spend the bulk of your lived experience. So as you can see, there are a number of different ways we can think about the importance and the function of any given type of group to you as an individual person. Okay, so besides these different types of groups, there are also some key characteristics that we can think about to help us understand how different groups are going to operate. And those key characteristics are size, structure, interdependence, and shared identity. Let's take each of these one at a time to understand how this characteristic might impact a group. When we think about size, first of all, we have to understand what is it that actually makes a group a group. So, according to the theory in literature and small group communication, a group really has to have a minimum of 3 members. If you have fewer than 3 members, you either have 2 persons in the interaction, which is what's referred to as a dyad, the kind of social configuration that we have in face-to-face conversations, for instance. Now, a dyad may be involved in problem solving or relationships, to be sure, but it doesn't have the critical mass of different perspectives and points of view involved in order to really qualify as a group. And of course, if you're just one person, then you can't very well be a group. Now, the literature also tells us that larger groups are going to be more complex and are going to have greater probability for engaging in some form of miscommunication. And so one of the things we want to think about in terms of group effectiveness is how many people are in that group in the first place. We can illustrate this pretty simply. Let's take a look at this 5-member group. Now, each of these persons are going to be involved in communicative interactions with any configuration of other persons in this group. So if we look just in terms of possible one-on-one interactions in the group, we come up with something like this. Now, as you can see, there are a lot of different ways in which one member of a group can potentially interact with another member of a group. Now, this isn't even counting the fact that of the 5 members of this group, you can also have smaller configurations of 3 persons talking with each other, leaving 2 persons out. You could have a configuration where 4 people are talking together, leaving 1 person out. And so that's just going to increase the number of possible combinations of social interactions you can have in any given group. Now, if we do something as seemingly simple as adding just 1 more person to the group, well, the amount of complexity in social interactions is really going to explode. This is what the one-on-one interaction possibilities look like with a 6-person group as opposed to the 5-person group we just looked at. As you can see, there is a significantly larger number of possible combinations of social interactions. And again, this is just the one-on-ones. This doesn't include the numbers of different 3-person combinations or 4-person combinations. The bottom line is, the more people you have in the group, the more complicated the social interactions are going to be. One really helpful study illustrates the relationship between the size of the group in terms of its number of interactions, as well as the maximum decision-making accuracy of that group. In this study, maximum decision-making accuracy is determined by a probability formula. What are the odds that whether you have a consensus decision-making model or a majority rules decision-making model, that you're going to have enough individuals in the group that they will end up making a decision that turns out to be the right decision? And so according to this study by Rogers, a 5-member group really is the sweet spot. It maximizes the possibilities of decision-making accuracy, which really plateaus once you get to 4 persons. After that, the larger the group size is, you're not really going to get much better in terms of the accuracy of the decision-making. However, on the other hand, once you get past 4 members of a group, the complexity of the interactions really starts to exponentially increase. So 5 members is the sweet spot. Once you get to 6, once you get to 7, things are still pretty close. But if that group number is going to be over 7, things start getting really complicated without getting much more productive. So, a lot of the literature tells us that 5 to 7 members of any given group is going to be where you want to be in order to make the best kind of decisions with the minimal amount of complicated interactions and possibility for miscommunication. The larger the committee, the more problems that committee is going to have actually being productive. Amazon CEO Jeff Bezos actually tells us that one really helpful rule of thumb for what makes for a productive group is the 2-pizza rule. In other words, you don't want to have any kind of meeting of a group where they're going to try to get things done if you can't feed the members of that group with 2 pizzas. Because after that, then you're going to have too many people in the mix. It's going to get complicated without getting to be more productive. Besides the size of the group, the structure of the group is going to make a really big difference as well when we think about how this group is actually going to interact and accomplish its goals. Now, structures can involve things such as internal influences. A group is, after all, made of people. And so the personal characteristics that each person brings to the group is going to have some kind of impact on the rest of the group. And so one way in which this manifests itself in really important ways is the emergence, or sometimes the intentionally structured presence, of team roles. In any kind of team, a leader is going to emerge at some point based on specific kinds of personality characteristics that lead them through a variety of communication variables to be the one that's able to take charge and to motivate and organize everybody else. And there are going to be other folks that are going to sometimes emerge in a leader role and or take other kinds of responsibilities. If you've ever been in a small group for a class project, for instance, and really insisted upon asking, well, this group really doesn't have a leader, we all work together. Well, that's probably not entirely true, and if it is entirely true, it's probably problematic for reasons that we'll get to in just a moment. So the people that are in the group are going to bring internal influences to that group, but there can also be external influences as well. Sometimes the size of the group is going to be something that the group itself isn't able to determine. You're just assigned to a committee or assigned to a team, and that number of people is what you've got to work with. Sometimes the task that the group is going to be involved in trying to achieve is something that, again, is outside of the group's control. Maybe it's something that a teacher or a boss at a workplace is going to assign. And of course, things like the resources that any group has at its disposal when trying to figure out how they're going to communicate and how they're going to get things done, it's going to have a big impact. One really important factor that doesn't get enough attention when thinking about the structure of groups is the way that groups operate in terms of network structures. In other words, how is it that people within the group actually interact? And those network structures can be formal or informal. A formal network structure, for instance, might be the configuration of responsibilities in an office where there's a particular chain of command, and certain members of the group need to report to other members of the group, and certain members of the group might be responsible for disseminating information to other members of the group. Now, of course, in less formal groups, you can have less formal network structures, where the flow of communication within the group is something that just organically emerges based on the personalities and the motivations involved within the group's individual members. Let's take a look at two alternative group structures to see how the communication flow works in some really different ways that have their advantages and disadvantages. On the one hand, we can take a look at a configuration that might be called a circle group. On the other hand, let's take a look at a configuration we could call a wheel group. The circle group looks like a circle. The wheel group, you can imagine, is similarly functioning as a circle, except there's a central hub in the middle that connects the various pieces of the wheel together. Now, a circle group is a decentralized structure with focused contacts. You can see that, imagine your bill in the lower right-hand corner of this circle. You're going to be primarily interacting with Stephanie and Callie. There's a couple of people with whom you are primarily communicating. And Stephanie's communicating with you, but also communicating with Eric, but not Callie. And Callie's communicating with you, but she's also communicating with Winston, not with Stephanie. So there's no real necessary linchpin of somebody that communicates with every single person in the group. So this is a decentralized structure. This kind of structure might be particularly helpful if any single member of a group gets some information and needs to share it with the rest of the group quickly. Rather than have to try to be the one responsible for getting the information to everybody, all you have to do, if you're Bill, is to let Stephanie and Callie know, and then you'll know that Stephanie and Callie are eventually going to get the word out to everybody else. Now, by contrast, a wheel structure is a centralized structure with one very reachable person. This is the kind of group that you might consider that has a more traditional leadership structure. In this configuration, for instance, if you're Tara, you're the person that's in the center. You are the hub of the wheel. And so you would be the person that's responsible for being able to get information out to everybody else in the group, and everybody else in the group would be reporting directly to you and communicating things to you. So rather than essentially depending on everybody else to get a message out to everybody as you would in a circle group, Any single person, say Shadow or Pam, would get the information to you, Tara, and Tara, you would be responsible to get the information to everybody else. Now, what are the possible pros and cons of these kinds of configurations? Well, the wheel structure, according to the research, is better for speed and efficiency. You've got somebody at the top, as it were, that's going to be primarily responsible for making sure that everybody is on what they need to do and that information quickly goes to and from to everywhere that it needs to be. So it's something that can operate more quickly and without a lot of extra conversation. On the other hand, according to research in network structures, a circle configuration may be better for collaboration on solving complex problems. And there are going to be some possible reasons for this that we're going to visit in a subsequent video in this series, actually, on group decision making. But you can imagine that if you don't have one central leader giving everybody their marching orders and being the primary conduit for communication for everybody else, then this decentralized structure is really going to rely on different members talking to other different members and passing those messages along to everybody else. So there's more inclusive conversation, and this kind of inclusive conversation is going to be something that's important when solving the problem is going to require getting multiple points of view and weighing them back and forth before ultimately the group makes a decision. This is a slower process, it's a less efficient process, but if you're trying to solve a complex problem, this may be the way that you need to go. On the other hand, if you've got relatively straightforward tasks and problems you need to resolve, and the focus is on we need to get it done fast and we need to not waste our time and our resources, then a wheel structure may be something that you need. Now, no matter what the network structure configuration is, whether it's a circle or a wheel, both of these models show us the importance of interdependence in a small group. Interdependence essentially means that group members share a common purpose and a common fate. Everybody in the group depends on everybody else in order to accomplish the things that the group is trying to accomplish, and the group is essentially going to sink or swim together. Anybody who's ever been in a collaborative project team for a class or for a particular workplace assignment knows the importance of interdependence. And sometimes that's one of the things that makes small group collaboration a bit irksome or problematic. Many of us think about our own individual circumstances and our own individual fate and think to ourselves, well, my grade is riding on this, or my position at work is really riding on this. I'd rather do it myself rather than depend on other people. However, the research on group communication tells us something really important, and that is the interdependent nature of groups can lead to higher quality performance and output, especially when group members are accountable for their actions. And this is because, quite frankly, the old cliche is usually true, all else being equal. 2 heads are better than 1, and 3 to 7 heads are better than 2. In other words, if you've got a variety of different perspectives, if you've got diverse standpoints and identities all coming together to have a say, to think about the possibilities, then you've got a greater opportunity to actually come up with something that's better. Because every person in the group has the capacity to come up with a great idea or a perspective for evaluating a piece of the puzzle that you might not be able to come up with all by yourself. Now, interdependence is connected in some ways to another really important characteristic of small groups, and that's shared identity. In brief, you can think about shared identity as establishment of the in-group as opposed to the out-group. In other words, the group understands itself as more than just a collection of lone rangers. A group is an entity in and of itself, and they understand who they are, in part, in terms of who they are not. Now, what is it that forms the core of the shared identity? Well, it could be a shared goal, or it could be a sense of the previous accomplishments that this group has achieved. And of course, in many contexts, groups actually engage in the use of symbolic identity markers, ways to actually identify themselves not only within, but also to any external audiences. This is who we are. It's no accident, for instance, that in competitive sports, teams have a name, and that team doesn't just have a name like the University of Missouri football team. We're the Mizzou Tigers, right? We have Truman the Tiger as a mascot. We have particular slogans such as One Mizzou and Mizzou Ra and those kinds of things. And sometimes even things like branded clothing and other kinds of swag, as silly as it might seem when you first say it, actually can provide a sense in which every member of the group can really identify themselves symbolically to the public as well as to themselves. This is who we are. And all of these aspects of shared identity, no matter how it's defined, have the potential to feed into a really desirable characteristic of effective groups, and that's cohesion. A group is cohesive if the members identify with and like the group's task and other group members. Having a sense of shared identity means that we get along, we understand ourselves as on the same team, and because we have this sense of shared identification, we work together more effectively as a unit, as opposed to a collection of individuals. So far, we've been talking about what small groups are, but what do small groups actually do? Well, as is the case with pretty much any other kind of communication, there are at least three primary categories of needs that small group communication is going to serve. The first categorical function of small groups is meeting instrumental needs. We become members of small groups and we communicate and act within small groups because we're trying to achieve something. We need some kind of outcome or goal or consequence, and so we do what we do in the group in order to get those things done. At the same time, however, we also engage in small groups for relational needs. We end up forming connections, be they friendships, be they collegial, professional work relationships, and of course, don't forget that groups such as families are also small groups that have certain relational needs as well. So we fulfill our needs for social connection with other people by participating in these groups. And finally, small groups can also fulfill identity needs. In a previous video in the series, we talked about how self-concept can be informed in part by a sense of social identity. The groups with which we affiliate and we engage in interpersonal interactions with give us some sense of who we are. I identify myself as a member of this group, and I can learn more about myself and understand myself a bit better to the extent that I can perceive how other members of this group are perceiving my sense of identity. Now, small groups, of course, sound pretty great so far. It's important to recognize that there are drawbacks of small group communication that many of you are probably already familiar with. The first one is that small groups are going to engage in slower decision making and slower movements to action compared to individuals. If you have to make a decision and act on it all by yourself, then you don't necessarily have to get the approval of other folks, right? So you can make the decision and act on it as soon as you feel like it. Whereas small groups are going to need to engage in a discursive process and ultimately decide how they want to act, when they're going to act, and then they actually need to plan the logistics of action. Connected to this, as you can imagine, small groups require organizational coordination that can often be really complicated. Anybody that's been involved in a project team for a class project or a work-related task knows that this can sometimes be really difficult because, after all, groups are made up of a collection of individuals, and trying to figure out how to get all of those individuals on the same page in terms of their scheduling, in terms of being able to be in the same location at the same time, or, as we're discovering at the time of making this video in 2020, that if it's very difficult for us to be all at the same place at the same time, do we all have access to the same kind of communication channels and technological media that are necessary in order to connect and do the things that we need to do? And of course, in order for groups to be effective in doing what they need to do, there's a real need for an other-centered standpoint. In other words, if you're a member of a group, you need to think about the group, and you need to think about other members of the group. A group is not a collection of solely self-interested individuals. If that's the case, then one of the things that is often observed, and I'm sure that anyone watching this video is going to be familiar with it, is the concept of social loafing. In many groups, it is a regretful truism that you're going to have somebody in the group that is going to see themselves and their own particular sense of convenience as more important than the group and the other folks within the group. So if they're going to benefit from the final results of the group's work, then they're making a rational, self-interested cost-benefit decision to actually not do anything because they know that they can benefit from everybody else. Now, of course, just because this is something that is often ubiquitous in group communication, it doesn't necessarily mean that small group communication and activity is always going to be a problematic thing that's rife with conflict. There are ways in which you can get around social loafing by engaging in the kinds of small group communication that get everybody on the same page and hold each other accountable. And that's what ultimately leads us to the advantages of small groups. It's important to note that small groups provide shared decision-making and shared resources. So it's not as if one individual is going to be held accountable for rise or fall, sink or swim. Is this task going to be completed or not? Folks are going to be able to participate in the decision-making in a way that's collaborative and provides more potential resources. Because after all, individuals also, in trying to accomplish a task, are only going to have what they bring with them, not just in terms of material resources, but in terms of their knowledge base and past experiences and their own point of view. If you've got a collection of different persons with different standpoints bringing different resources to the table, then you've got more to work with. Small groups also have a possibility that is impossible if you're just an individual actor, and that's the idea of synergy. Synergy, in a nutshell, is the potential for gains in performance or heightened quality of interactions when complementary members or member characteristics are added to existing ones. So, as I alluded to earlier, what you have in a small group is the opportunity of the different individuals within the group having different kinds of distinct experiences and knowledge bases and skill sets and points of view and particular values that have an opportunity to connect as puzzle pieces, if you will. There's the possibility that the different things that everybody is bringing to the table end up complementing one another so that the entire group ends up becoming what is sometimes referred to as a gestalt, or something where the whole is more than the sum of the parts. And this is why, finally, a key advantage of small groups is the potential for exposure to diversity. The bottom line is, any individual in a group is ultimately going to be a better communicator, a better thinker, and a better decision maker to the extent that you are exposed to diverse experiences and points of view. If everybody in a group has essentially the same subject position and the same points of view and are bringing the same kinds of things to the table, then you really don't have the opportunity to maximize synergy. You're all potentially going to be on the same page, but that page is going to have big blank spaces in it because there are going to be gaps that you just can't fill, because the most effective kind of groups need those diverse and complementary points of view, skill sets, and resources. Small groups that are able to take proactive advantage of strategic size and structural factors, that embrace a sense of interdependence and work to achieve a cohesive sense of shared identity, are able to use their collective knowledge, skill sets, perspectives, and other resources to meet their instrumental, relational, and identity needs in a way that synergistically takes advantage of diversity in order to make the best possible decisions for the most productive outcomes. So now we've got a fundamental foundation for understanding small group communication. What small groups are, what kinds of characteristics and functions they possess, and what kind of factors can have important impacts on how groups actually interact and accomplish what they need to accomplish. If you've got questions about this or any of the videos in this series, please don't hesitate to reach out and let me know. Otherwise, I'll see you next time.